very few women. What signal is this administration sending? What are the prospects for progress for women under the Trump administration?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me, but I think there are some very troubling signs that are going on in terms of women's prospects for progress. So on the one hand, he has done things like, President Trump has done things like appoint Kellyanne Conway, and he's now given his daughter Ivanka a position. So there are some kind of people that are Betsy DeVos as the Secretary of Education. There are faces that are at the table, if you will. But some of these policies are really designed to kind of stunt the ability to be able to have oversight of what's going on. So the executive order that you referred to repealed some requirements of federal contractors, that federal contractors have to disclose when they have been in violation of certain policies that are designed to protect the rights and the safety of workers in their companies. So, for example, if they violated the Americans with Disabilities Act, if they violated the Civil Rights Act, if they violated the Family and Medical Leave Act, they are required to disclose that so people would actually know that they've had a problem with that in the past, and that it could become, kind of subject to being a reason why they wouldn't continue to be a federal contractor is kind of the intent. And so when those things get appealed, or get repealed, excuse me, it makes it very difficult for women and other folks who are trying to get equal access to opportunities to actually have the data to present their case, because these things are no longer required to be made public. They instead can be hidden under the rug. And so I think it's a real challenge for women, to kind of figure out where they're going to be able to have progress on policy. They have, some folks who are claiming to represent them in the EOP, but they're not necessarily going to be represented on policy, and that's the challenge.
John, you have any response to
I
that?
do,
Is that
yeah,
fair?
I actually do have a couple things to say about that. First of all, you rightly pointed out that there are some prominent figures. Elaine Choi, Secretary of Transportation, Betsy DeVos, blah, blah, blah. Okay, goes on and on. So you do have women in Katie Walsh. You have women in high-profile positions in the administration. I think the bigger perspective that I always remind people you have to keep it in mind is that Donald Trump believes that overregulation suffocates businesses, and if businesses get suffocated, so does job growth. And so he approaches things like that, and he also thinks that the federal government shouldn't be in the business of overregulating. If a state wants to do that, that's their prerogative. And so he's basically, and it's a significant shift. The last 8 years, it was the reverse. Barack Obama felt that the federal government should dictate and the state should follow. President Trump thinks the state should have individual choice like a free market, and if you don't like it, you leave the state. That's what the difference is in perspective. I think what we're seeing here is freedom. And if there's any other better, more current reference than women being able to hear their voice, have their voice heard if they're exploited, look no further than Fox News, a giant corporation that I guarantee you would do anything to muffle these voices of women who have been harassed, and they can't stop it from getting out. If Fox News can't stop it from getting out, women have the power in today's day and age with phones and social media to get out these issues if they have it. I don't think you need federal regulations to regulate that.
You want to explain this arbitration process and how people get forced into arbitration?
Sure, and we can actually use the case of USC as an example. So most people, when they are hired, sign what's called an agreement that any dispute that they would have would be pursued under a process of arbitration, rather than you being able to file a claim and sue in open court. And so arbitration is a process that tends to favor, and this is the more empirical study of it as opposed to my personal opinion, never having gone through arbitration myself, tends to favor the employer in the sense that there are very few kind of legal protections in the sense of an open court juridical process that are applicable in an arbitration process. It still is a legal process, don't get me wrong, but it's designed, of course, to be more streamlined. So to your point earlier about the reason why employers tend to be in favor of arbitration is it's a more streamlined process. It also tends to be a more cost-effective process. And so those are some of the claims as to why it benefits employers versus the actual employees who might have a specific claim. And so when you think about what happened with Fox News, or when you think about any kind of dispute that could come up where an employee is claiming discrimination, either through the ADA, Civil Rights Act, Family and Medical Leave Act, or any of those kinds of policies. And remember, the Civil Rights Act is not just about race, right? It's about race, color, creed, national origin, and religion. So any of those kinds of claims, once you've signed up when you're as an employee, and again, it's usually on your first day or as you accept the job offer, to pursue things through arbitration, it then limits the amount of damages that you can get, and it also limits your ability to sue in open court. So you aren't necessarily talking to other employees who might be similarly situated. You aren't necessarily being able to really get, a more substantive justice process.
And John, I want to push you on one aspect of this, the transparency. How does it help create jobs? How is it over-regulation to say that companies that violate the Americans with Disabilities Act, we're going to know about that, or companies that violate some of these guaranteed protections for women, we're going to know about that?
Sure.
That now won't be known.
Sure. I can tell you because it happens in California all the time. Attorneys will set up people to go slip and fall and in order to extort a landowner that maybe inherited a building from the 1950s that isn't ADA compliant, and they don't have the resources to be ADA compliant. So it's a manufactured claim to extort the landowner or the landlord for money. The same thing I could see be extrapolated in federal contracting. Oh, you want to get your competitor out of this job? Go send 2 guys to trip and fall and file complaints. Let's put that on their record.
You probably have to send a couple hundred, because this is about statistics and transparency and knowing what's happening with these companies.
Okay, well,
it's not one or two. It's not
right.
the mythical lawyer,
Well, in corporate wars over a period of time, I don't see why they couldn't systematically cause lawsuits to occur, to put it on the record, to ding the record of somebody they know they're consistently competing with for federal contracts.
Any evidence that that's happened at federal contracting?
I can say definitively in my work, I work in the corporate war space. I don't do federal contracting, but the lengths to which corporations will go to damage one another, a simple slip and fall.
But I mean, we would know if this transparency was somehow or other being exploited by companies in the process.
How would you know that?
You would know it because you would find large-scale instances where some company was exploited, and then people went after that company, and the company would defend itself by saying exactly what you've just said.
I think the problem is if it's all done through lawyers, you have confidentiality. You can't claim it.
No, it's not confident. It's the opposite of confident. What we're going to have now is confidentiality.
No. What I'm saying is setting up the slip and fall cases and the different violations and the lawsuits would all be done through private firms. That all is through confidentiality. So there's no way to prove who's funding these things. Is what I'm trying to say. It's not like you'd be able to say, oh well, he's doing it to me. I don't think you'd ever be.
So it's a possibility, but we have no idea whether it's real.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to do?
No, for sure. So, Ehsan, for those of us who are TAs here, one of the things we're talking about right now are the travel bans and the executive orders that President Trump is issuing. So, one of the critiques is that the president's travel bans have been challenged on the grounds of potential religious discrimination against Muslims from selected countries. Do you believe we are conflating terrorism and the desire to protect our country with an increasing resentment toward a changing multiracial and multicultural country?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for having me here. Thank you guys for coming. If you were my students, I'd all give you extra credit, because it's like 6 o'clock and you guys are here. It's fantastic. I feel like I should be doing some spoken word here, but I'll save you guys the pain of me doing spoken word. Yeah, so just a small caveat. I'm still serving the government, the federal government, in an advisory capacity, so I'm going to avoid any direct questions addressed towards the federal government, just speak in my personal capacity as somebody who works on civil rights issues as a civil rights lawyer. So the short answer to your question about whether we are conflating terrorism with this kind of growth and kind of a multiracial polity in the United States is yes, but specifically, this is not a new problem, right? And we're actually, a colleague of mine and one of your professors, Dr. Errol Southers, is in the audience. He's sitting right there. He's the only guy, except for you, sir, wearing a suit and tie. Because,
You look good.
We have
You
sharp
look very
dressers
good.
here. So yes, and this is not a new problem, right? I mean, I'm talking broadly in the United States, do tend to maybe conflate's not the right word. We do tend to focus on acts of terror that really terrorize us, right, or rile the national psyche in a way that resonates with people, right? And this is contrary to actual evidence that exists, right? So if you actually go out, as I have, and talk to law enforcement officers, or you go look at polls that the international chiefs of police have taken, you ask them, what's the greatest threat in terms of terrorism to the United States? They'll list ISIS-inspired attacks, or to a limited extent, Al-Qaeda-inspired attacks, but they won't be number one on the list. Number one on the list will be neo-Nazi attacks or anti-government attacks, and the way we assess terrorism now is not based on those kind of priorities, right? In fact, there is a kind of a movement now to just talk about Islamic extremism, right? Religious extremism that is inspired by a faulty understanding of Islam, which exists, right? But in terms of the application of resources, that's not the case, right? And so we don't have the time to do it now, but if you start delving deeper into it, you start realizing that there's certainly elements that are tied to kind of identity, right? The identity of the people committing these attacks, more so than the actual threat. In other words, if the measure of lives lost is the way that we allocate resources to fighting terrorism, it is not a good way to fight terrorism when you're looking at the terrorism that results in a loss of lives that's less, assuming that the measure of lives lost is the way you want to actually allocate resources. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer to your short question.
Oh, I thought, John, you totally agree, right?
I mean, I actually do partially agree. If you look at statistics, gang crime is much more real threat to me on a daily basis in downtown Los Angeles than it is getting blown up by ISIS. However, I worry more about ISIS than I do gang crime. It's irrational, I know, but that's what I believe, and especially because it's so sensationalized, right? It's the mainstream media. Every time you see a train blow up or you see planes flying into towers, I mean, that idea of dying is so horrific that we want to do whatever we can to thwart it. And so, unfortunately, terrorists, by and large, they before they blow themselves up, they're not praising Christianity, right? So they start to get this.
Many times they are.
Okay.
It's just that we don't talk about it.
Okay.
Right.
Well, the ones we're talking about on the mainstream media, they're not praising Christianity. So that's how it goes. So consequently, our political leaders are going to respond to that on both sides of the aisle.
And so I guess my response, if I'm allowed to respond to it,
Of course you are.
not a response, but kind of is that I expect more out of my political leaders, right? I actually expect them, put them in office, I pay their salaries, and I expect them to actually keep me safe, right? So I want them to use a little bit more brain power and to actually think about how my taxpayer dollars are actually going to go to keep me safe, right? Let's take one real quick example. How many of you took a train? This is LA, nobody takes trains. How many of you I'm from LA, by the way, UCLA, go Bruins. All right, I should
We're gonna have
walk
to
out
cut the
now?
mic.
Should I walk
Cut the
out now?
mic.
All right.
I think I just won this debate.
He just lost his constituency.
How many?
You were doing very well up till then.
Okay. All right, you know what? You got to take one for the team. How many of you guys take trains or have taken trains recently? Okay. So let's say you're taking Amtrak. On the East Coast, we take Amtrak a lot, right? Do you go through metal detectors when you go to Union Station in Washington, D.C.? Not at all. How many people get on the train when they get on, an Amtrak train? Hundreds of people, more than they get on a plane. The train pulls into a massive station, Penn Station in New York, let's say. That's a big threat, right? But we don't focus on those issues because we focus on, 16 years ago, we had a terrible attack that used airplanes and airports as a mechanism of committing that terrorist attack. So we just focus on airplanes and airports. And if you're a terrorist with any reasonable amount of intelligence, and most terrorists are idiots, but let's say you have a little bit of intelligence, right? You can just switch your tactics and your priorities to train stations because they're relatively unsecured. And I want my political representatives to actually focus on the harm, irrespective of the ideology that motivates that harm. That's what I want them to focus on. That's what's going to keep me safe.
Ange-Marie, you have anything on this?
I think the only thing I would add is in terms of allocating, going back to the kind of Trump administration, what they're doing is they've now increased defense spending by $54 billion, and they want to cut other programs, right? And again, some of those other programs actually keep people safe and alive in a stronger way in terms of how many people they actually serve, right? So when we think about this, the example I came up with was the idea of public health, right? We know that certain forms of cancer kill more people than other forms of cancer do. So we tend to expect that people would actually fund the research in the cancers that affect a lot of people. Again, not that we shouldn't fund anything on the smaller cancers, but that the bigger cancers are going to be able to get further progress if you give them more funding because it will affect more people and save more lives. That's the same kind of logic that I think you're talking about in terms of terrorism, right? If we know that school shootings, right, no matter who performs them, are one of the leading causes of death of young people, then we should have regulations and things that actually save those young lives, right? Because more of those lives are dying than die in some of these other kinds of attacks, right? So from my vantage point, it's about being consistent with your logic, right? If you misdiagnose the problem, you're bound to have, the misprescription in terms of the solution, and then you end up with the same problem over and over again.
Fabian, you want to pull this back to immigration?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And keeping on with the theme of equal rights, opening up to the panel. So we're also seeing stepped up deportations and even the arrest of some of the dreamers, even though the DACA executive order has not been repealed. What do you think the administration is headed in terms of immigration and the undocumented?
I could take that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you saw the article. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal. It might have been Bloomberg yesterday that said illegal immigration to the United States is down. I think it's almost 70% this year. Why? Policy hasn't been changed, right? It's because they know somebody might actually enforce the border laws. So we're already seeing a decrease in illegal immigration just by a change in administration. I think what you're going to see is not a massive roundup of illegals. You're going to see focusing on criminal illegal aliens, violent criminal, not people who just broken our border law, our immigration laws. We're going to deport them. That's where Trump's going to focus on. I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of his administration, you see some kind of immigration reform that a Marco Rubio or somebody would try to put an expedited form pathway to citizenship for those people who are legal here and aren't criminals.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that the best thing that we can hope for, so in other words, I think we are already at worst case scenario in terms of deportations. I think to actually agree with you about, what could possibly happen is that a Marco Rubio or someone could put forth a comprehensive immigration reform that I think would also seek to correct some of the worst abuses of what's going on right now, right? So one of the things that we've seen is there has been a very indiscriminate kind of pickup of people in terms of deportation. So when people are actually coming to what they've already agreed to do, right? They're coming to actually show up at INS for their actual appointment that they are legally required to have, right? They're being deported. The corrective and the piece that I think that Rubio should pick up is military veterans. Military veterans who were undocumented, who signed up and registered for serving our country with the promise of, I actually had an undergraduate student at my former institution do her senior honors thesis on this, that there were significant numbers of undocumented folks who joined the military with the promise of, through your service, right, 16 years ago in the war in Iraq, you will then be able to, get on the pathway to citizenship. And those folks are actually getting deported. And so I think those are some of the worst abuses that hopefully a comprehensive immigration reform that would be bipartisan, so I think you would get bipartisan support if you're talking about correcting some of those worst abuses that we see are going on right now, because right now there's no systematic policy, right? There's this kind of, we're gonna do this and we're gonna do it first and then think about it afterwards, right? And so that's what was happened with the travel ban, and now it's had to be ratcheted back. And so again, if you have a more measured approach, if you go through the Congress, you actually have a shot, I think, at something that could roll back some of these abuses.
You know, I agree with you, but I'll disagree in the sense of I think the Republicans and Trump could propose exactly what you said, just that clause, and not a single Democrat would vote for it. Because we're in such a hyper-polarized, you have to stop Trump at every, you cannot give him a win. It does not matter if it's good for America or who it's good for, you have to vote no. So I just don't know if he could get that passed.
Does that remind you of anything that occurred in the
I've
last 8 years?
never heard of that before.
Let's
Can I add something real quick?
I was going to give you a follow-up to this, but you can do whatever you want. Go ahead first.
No, okay. Why don't you give me the follow-up?
Well, let's say John is wrong, and
Impossible.
Trump.
He's humble too.
You and Donald Trump, absolute certainty. Let's say you're wrong and you don't get a Rubio-like reform through, which I think, by the way, would be very difficult with Steve King and the Freedom Caucus in the House. You'd have to have Democrats do it. Let's say you don't. Let's say you have pretty draconian policies here. The kinds of things Ange-Marie describes keep happening. In the 1990s, the California GOP ran on a heavily anti-immigrant platform, endorsing Proposition 187, which probably kept Pete Wilson in the governor's office. He was well behind when he started running on that. Some people say this is the reason why California has become so heavily blue. Ehsan, could you see some kind of political backlash occur across the United States that would have the same impact in terms of mobilizing Hispanic and minority voters?
It's already occurring. Yeah. It's already happening. I mean, you can see coalitions of communities that are coming together that are motivated by, how, the United States at large is treating undocumented immigrants. I will say one more thing to kind of add to this is there's a lot of, I've kind of been looking at this issue for several years, right? And so there's a lot of misinformation about immigration reform, undocumented immigrants, right? So, who do you think deported more undocumented immigrants? President Obama or President Bush? Okay, well, I'm at USC, so
Very
of course I know the
informed.
answers. Yeah, so President Obama, right? And so a lot of people outside of USC maybe or other places like USC don't know this, right? And the other thing is that undocumented immigrants that come in, they have to undergo quite a significant amount of trials and tribulations prior to even getting to the land border, assuming we're only talking about the southern land border. They're going through a lot, right? And then they get to the southern land border, right? So by the time, and a lot of this comes from interviews that I've done with folks, by the time you come to the southern land border, to go back to your point, you're not, you've gone through enough where CBP or the Border Patrol is not really kind of the threat in your mind. I mean, starvation, being, misused or abused, death, things like that. Deportation back, sure, it's not what you want, but that's not the primary factor motivating you to kind of not cross the border, right? And so even if it's kind of stepped up, you'll just try again somehow, right? And the other thing is the primary motivation, right? We're talking about demotivation. The primary motivation is what? Why would people come if they're undocumented? Why are they coming to the United States? What's the primary motivation? Who said money? Okay, not to be capitalist, but like money, right? So money, or in other words, jobs, right? Economic opportunity, right? And so study over study has found that the reason why undocumented immigration has declined in the United States over the course of several years and is continuing to decline is actually based on the fact that there's less jobs for people. Some of that is due to enforcement, right? Because we enforce, the government enforces, goes to businesses and things like that and does enforcement actions there. But a lot of it is due to the fact that there's just not enough jobs or not enough jobs that pay well, right? And so we've been seeing a significant drop. And if you actually, instead of asking me, you actually ask the people, right? Like, why are you not undertaking this massive risk? Because the reward at the end of the day is not present or not worth it or is not tangible.
Either of you want to weigh in?
I think the only thing I would add is to think about California, and if you are a data geek like me, there's actually an interactive map you can look at, because I think one of the things that happened in California that would also need to happen on the national basis is you would also have to have a huge naturalization push that comes prior to the voter registration push. So one of the reasons why California turned so blue in 1994 is that not just that Latino citizens were upset and annoyed and feeling threatened because many of them lived in mixed status families about the threat of 187, but that those who were legal permanent residents, right, so those who were here legally, who were qualified for citizenship, there was an actual push to actually get them naturalized so that then they were qualified to vote in the next election, right? And then once they voted, they never looked back at Pete Wilson. They never looked back at the Republicans, because they understood, right, what the threat was that was presented to them. So I think the other thing that needs to happen is, if folks want that to happen, you actually have to start now. There are 590 days until the midterm elections, right? People have to get naturalized and then turn out to vote. So I think one of the challenges there, although there's this really cool map that the Center for Study of Immigrant Integration put together, where you can literally go county by county and look at where there are people who are eligible for naturalization, and they have it by ethnicity, they have it by all kinds of stuff. But one of the challenges there, of course, is that takes a systematic effort, right? And so nonprofits and organizations have to dedicate resources to getting that done. That's not the kind of thing that the Democratic Party is going to invest in. That's not the kind of thing that the Republican Party is going to invest in. It's actual on-the-ground community organizations who are going to get that done. That's what happened here in California, and that's what will happen elsewhere if we see evidence of that going forward.
Yeah, my Democratic consultant friends always tell me, if they go, don't worry, we'll get you in the long run because of shifting demographics. Immigrants over time will end up becoming voters, whether they're, when they're first naturalized, they become voters, or eventually their kids will become voters, and there will be more of them than there are of us. And that's what my Dem friends keep telling us. I think the risk, Bob, you run is the Democrats' outrage to Donald Trump over this last cycle, there's still a lot of white folks. Still a lot of white folks in the Electoral College. And the Democratic Party has systematically become the party of open borders and refugees, largely because of their rhetoric. And that doesn't line up with folks, with swing voters necessarily in New Hampshire and Wisconsin and Michigan, who are worried about keeping their jobs.
Yeah, I think I would add to that, if I may. Donald Trump drew to an inside straight by, you change 38,000 votes in 3 states, and he's not president. And as time goes on and you proceed toward 2020, I think they have to worry more about millennials. They do have to worry about Hispanics. And I'm not sure they're worried about African Americans. But I think there's a caution there that ultimately you can only live. One of my close friends is a Republican consultant in Washington who says we should not be deluded about 2016. We do have to somehow or other talk to the diversity of America at some point, which allows Fabian to ask another question.
Yeah, thank you. So, Dr. H, keeping on, discussing about the Black community and African American community, is President Trump reaching out to these communities in any way? And how can he and the Republican Party speak to Black concerns while promoting measures like ID laws that make it difficult to vote? Have the president and the GOP just written off the African American community?
Well, I think I'll start with the voter ID laws because it also connects to what we were just talking about, right? So one of the hedges that we've seen state by state in terms of trying to counteract and counterbalance the demographics, right, are these voter ID laws. And I'll put in a plug for one of Fabian's friends and one of my former graduate students who actually did a study that was reported very widely and is now being used in a voter ID case as part of an amicus brief in Texas, that the natural experiment the field experiment he was able to do demonstrated that the legislators who had higher levels of, I think it was called racial, it wasn't racial bias, but it was racial kind of hostility, that was the word that they used, were actually more likely to support these voter ID bans, right? So whatever explanations narratively or in the media they gave for why they supported these bans, the fact was they had this level of racial hostility that was also part of the calculus in terms of what they found. And so Matt and Christian Gross were very much able to kind of illustrate that this is not simply about voter fraud, as is often, said to be the case. It's not simply about other things. It's also about some of this racial hostility, right? So those voter ID laws end up being the hedge against the demographic shifts. They become the protection that then prevents, and stunts millennial voters' ability to effectively exercise their power, right? Because you can no longer just show your student ID in some states to actually cast your vote, right? You have to end up getting a driver's license, even though you spend your life, your hometown is in a totally different state. And so, again, all of those kinds of things that have been empirically documented to be driven partly by race. But to come back to the question of African Americans, I think that one of the things that we haven't talked about, and it just happened on Friday, and again, so many things are happening every single day that it's difficult to keep track. And I think part of that is not kind of unique to Donald Trump in the sense of we are in a cycle where so much, change is occurring and so much is being reported, it's hard to keep up. But one of the things that happened on Friday is that Attorney General Jeff Sessions revealed in a reply to the city of Baltimore about a possible consent decree regarding police violence and police misconduct, that he had ordered a nationwide review of every consent decree that is currently in place with local police departments. So if you don't know what consent decrees are essentially agreements between a locality, say a city or a city police force, and the Department of Justice. And so what ends up happening is that the Department of Justice is called in or has seen fit to do an investigation. So for example, in Ferguson, after the killing of Michael Brown, the Department of Justice did a federal investigation of the police practices in Ferguson, Missouri, and the surrounding areas, right? Once they see that there has been reasonable evidence of some police misconduct, right? Whether it's excessive force, whether it's illegal searches and seizures, all kinds of different things, they then say they're going to file a court order demanding that the police stop and end these patterns and practices of misconduct, okay? Once that happens, so once the DOJ has determined that these patterns exist, what the city and locality can actually do, and sometimes it's the city, LAPD has been under multiple consent decrees, for example, Newark, New Jersey, the New Jersey State Troopers, Cleveland, Ohio, Ferguson, so it's a very common practice in terms of trying to reform police forces. Once that happens, they can actually come to an agreement. And when they negotiate that consent decree agreement, they then file it with a judge, and the judge has to approve it in order for it to be enforced, right? Those kinds of reviews of consent decrees that AG Jeff Sessions just revealed he was doing, right? So he revealed this through a letter to the city of Baltimore about their consent decree, that there was this broader nationwide review, really does kind of lend credence to the idea that African Americans are not a particularly valued part of, what would be considered a Trump coalition or a Trump vision of America, probably put more broadly. Because again, that's one of the signal issues of African Americans of this time, is police violence and police killings of men and women who are of African descent. So I think that's one of the key measures that I would use to say that they're not going to be part of, the main vision of America.
John, do you think that the Trump administration will reach out to African Americans, and with what prospect of success?
I think they will, but the tethering between the Democratic voting propensity in the African American community, is so tightly knit. I don't care if it's Trump or any Republican. That's a hard nut to crack. Period. So I think they're going to try to win them on issues. The way you win them is you lower crimes in cities. You bring charter school reform and better educations to their areas that have been under Democratic rule for the last 8 years and are not any better off. In fact, they're worse off. So I think they're going to try to win them on issues. As it relates to voter ID laws, it always cracks me up. I think a ballot is far more lethal than a gun. And Democrats think you have to have wait times and background checks and all this to own a firearm, but anyone can walk up and vote. There was a story 2 years ago. I live in downtown LA. I showed up at my polling place, And I think I was the first Republican to vote that day. In my polling place, there's like 4 Democratic booths, and then there's 1 Republican. There's a lady in front of me who came to vote, and she was a Democrat, and she attempted to pull out her driver's license because she wanted to hand it to the poll worker. Says, here I am, and the poll worker said, oh, no, what's your name? She looked at me, she looked at him, she said, well, don't you need my ID? And he goes, no, we don't need your ID. When she looks at me, she goes, well, then can't anybody just vote? And I was like, thank you. That's exactly the problem. Anybody could vote. I've had it multiple times where I tell them my name's John Thomas. They go, oh yeah, John Thomas on South Broadway. I go, no, it's actually on Hill. So there's problems here. I don't see a reason why it's a bad thing. Now, do we need to make it incredibly easy to get identification cards? Absolutely. Do we need to send out public notices that elections are approaching? You may need to go get a free identification card. Absolutely. But I think voter ID laws are a good thing, and Republicans certainly support it. I think most mainstream Americans would support it as well.
As long as people can get the ID, and there are some ID laws in some states in the South where you have to travel 50 or 100 miles to get an approved voter ID. I mean,
are you living on a farm in the middle of nowhere?
No. There are places in Texas where there's not a nearby place where you can get a driver's license, and you've got to drive. And if you're older and you don't want to drive a car, and you don't drive a car, it could become a big problem. My difficulty with it, by the way, is that the evidence of voter fraud existing in this country is de minimis.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, less than 14 cases, generally given an election out of millions of people that vote. So
14 cases of voter fraud.
Yeah, and this is a bipartisan number. This is not a.
Okay.
This is a number that.
It was a study by a guy at Loyola Marymount.
That's right.
Who
Yeah,
did an empirical
this
study.
was a peer-reviewed bipartisan number. There's been congressmen and women from both sides of the aisle that have talked about the fact that this is not saying that there's no mistakes. Of course, mistakes happen, but the voter fraud is like implies an intent to fool the system. So let's call it voter error. Okay, incidences of voter error. In other words, people making mistakes, which is kind of what you outlined, somebody saying the wrong name or something like that. Voter error is so low.
I didn't say that was a mistake. That somebody could have said, my name's John Thomas, knowing there are 10 John Thomases in downtown LA. It doesn't have to be a mistake.
Either way, whether you call it fraud, or I tend to call it error because there's no evidence that there's this kind of coterie of folks in the United States that just want to, fool the system, right? It's, so incidences of error or fraud are so low that it's not a problem that needs a solution, right? So it's a solution in search of a problem that doesn't exist.
I want to cover one other area before we turn it over to the audience. And Diane Abbott isn't here, but I think we should talk about LGBTQ issues. The president did not revoke the Obama executive order on non-discrimination with federal contractors, despite pressure to do so. But he has ordered the census not to include LGBTQ people in the 2020 census, not to ask questions that would identify them, how many of them there are, has withdrawn the Obama administration's attempt to protect younger kids who are transgender from using the bathroom of their choice. What's going to happen here? I mean, where does this all lead? The president seems to me somewhat divided about this and pulled in two different directions, one by some of his supporters on the right, and on the other hand, by some of the folks from New York who are around him.
I mean, I think on the social issues, the president's a squishy mod to his core. I think he's fiscally conservative, and he just believes that the bigger government gets, the more the worse it is for regular citizens and job creators. So I don't think he's really passionate either way on those issues. So time will tell. I don't know exactly his future positions.
Ange-Marie, what do you think?
I think that, I actually agree with you about Trump in terms of these social issues. I think he could go either way. I think one of the places where he is very swayable, or people who has a lot of sway over him in terms of some of these issues, is are his daughter and his son-in-law, right, Ivanka and Jared Kushner. So to the degree that this has not yet happened on certain levels, I do think that that's part of what's going on, right? And so what ends up happening in terms of the evangelical Christian vote, right? So this is where he's kind of turning some things over to Mike Pence as the vice president. Those votes that are, kind of very rigid about LGBTQ identity, the non-collection of data in the 2020 census kind of becomes the olive branch that, is designed to kind of mollify those voters and those leaders, in Congress and elsewhere, who then, won't say anything about the fact that some of these laws haven't actually been, rolled back yet. So it becomes kind of the middle ground, if you will, that those aren't, the policies aren't rolled back. However, we're not going to collect data. And the reason why, of course, for those of you who aren't familiar with why the census matters so much, collecting the data really does matter because it's one of the primary ways by which we allocate resources in this country, right? So this goes back to that same kind of logic that Ehsan was talking about in terms of terrorism, right? If you can't count people, right, you don't know where to actually send the money that needs to actually cover things, right? So we're talking about everything from federal highway funds that would cover, I just drove over 7 potholes, on my way home today in order to be on this panel. And so, those kinds of things are based on, calculations that civil engineers make about how many people are driving on those roads in Los Angeles, right, versus how many people are driving on those roads in Dubuque, Iowa, right? So counting these kinds of things has impact for all kinds of funding. And so what Trump is saying in not counting LGBTQ people in the census is that there is nothing in terms of federal allocations of funding that would actually require data on LGBTQ people. Now, of course, when we think about federal education policy, when we think about all kinds of workplace discrimination EEOC policies, we know that that's not the case, but the idea of not having the data to then support, we need to make sure that some of these things are covered and actually interrogated is really problematic, right? Because you can't make the case.
Or maybe health policy, too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Give anybody a chance up here, but then I want to turn this over to the audience. Okay, who's got a question? Right there.
Hello. I have 2 questions. Thank you. Okay, I have 2 questions. For my first question, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Thomas. I know you mentioned the term freedom when you were talking about people voting in states instead of federal law, but what you don't understand is that your freedom and my freedom will always, in this lifetime, be 2 different things. So you need to think before you use words like that. Your reality and my reality are always gonna be different. I am a Black, bisexual woman in America, and I guarantee you I am targeted. I can guarantee you, you've not felt the fear that I felt when my brother was pulled over and I thought we were both gonna die for him merging into the lane too fast, okay? So when you talk about freedom, be conscious of what people around you are dealing with, especially in a city like Los Angeles. It's very diverse. And what you need to realize is...
I think we should let
I'm sorry.
John respond.
Please respond.
It's not a question really, but I understand.
Yeah. I mean, I think I know where you're going. I appreciate your statement.
Okay, my question is, can you be more cognizant of the fact that freedom for you and freedom for me will always be different, okay? When you use that word, I just would like you to do that before, because
Sure.
It will give people the wrong impression. It will make you come across as a stereotypical Republican.
Right. Well, I empathize with your position. I'm sorry for those things that you felt, but I would say that I think the law does treat everybody equally. So I think that is what I'm talking about, and you have freedom of speech just like I have freedom of speech. So I'm sorry you feel that way, but what I'm saying, the difference between, I think what we have to focus on in here for a constructive conversation is that the difference between having the feds dictate that and the states dictate that is that I believe in freedom of choice. That if you're unhappy with the laws in California, there's probably another state that might better align with the laws that you like. And so I have the freedom to go to Texas or
John,
Nevada.
you've said that several times. Do you think most people in America have the freedom to simply pick up their roots and leave and go someplace else?
Yes.
And have the financial
Yeah, I do.
resources?
Yeah, it's a JetBlue flight for $60. Yeah, I do.
No, but you got to sell your house. You got to get a new house. You have to get a new job. I mean, look, if you leave it to the state of Mississippi, you're going to get a very different result than if you leave it to the state
Right,
of California.
and our founders intended there to be competition between states. So that's
And
that's
there
a
was, and it was
system
called the Civil War. And we settled the states'
Yeah.
rights issue, I think.
It says the difference in a single payer system and competition between
no,
states. You
look,
know,
I think I understand what she's saying. Is she's saying that she has a different life experience than you do, and that simply moving to another place, and by the way, I don't know what would be a better place than Los Angeles for all of its difficulties, that moving, that probably isn't a way out. And I think what she's suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have to have the capacity to put ourselves in each other's shoes. And people on your side of the divide have to put yourself in the shoes of folks who are on the other side of the divide, and vice versa. I think that's all she was really suggesting.
sure, and I appreciate your comment.
Hi, yeah, thank you all for coming first. And just jumping off of that, what you said, Mr. Thomas, about the federal government being separate from the states. Something that Professor Shrum touched on was the divide that seems to be occurring in conservatism, particularly with Donald Trump's views of where states' rights and federal rights land. So if you're advocating for states' rights, but then federally defunding Planned Parenthood or advocating for that, I'm just curious where conservatives land on the issues that sort of seem that should be more left up to states that view things, but then federally you are moving towards that.
Great question. Part of the problem is you're unpacking. If you're Donald Trump, you're unpacking decades of mismanagement where the federal authorities have grown, both in their authority to regulate, but also their budgetary authority. Trump and conservatives say the feds never should have been involved with Planned Parenthood, that if states want to be involved, that's their choice. And so the feds are stepping back, saying, we don't think that's the role of the federal government, and if the states choose to engage in that, that's perfectly fine.
Ange-Marie?
I was actually going to go back to the earlier point
Okay,
and just talk briefly about the notion of freedom. And just, I think one of the important things in thinking about freedom is to realize it's non-zero sum, in the sense of these two freedoms can coexist. That's part of the great experiment that started in 1789, right? That we were supposed to be able to coexist in terms of freedoms. And so that your freedom to exist should not necessarily mean that her freedom cannot exist, right? And the same and vice versa. So I think that's an important thing. And the reason why I came to think about that was in thinking about this, picking up and kind of voting with your feet by moving to different states. I think that functions very differently for women. I think that functions very differently for women in particular age brackets. So if you look at Generation X, these are the people who were born in the late 1960s to the early 80s, right? They're your parents for the most part. They are taking care of both a generation of your grandparents, for those students in your audience, as well as still covering, what's financially necessary for you all to be in college and, to kind of back up, whatever student loans that you've taken, right? They are kind of filling the gap. And so I think you have a generation of women, primarily women, because women are still primarily the caregivers, who don't have the luxury of just kind of saying, oh yeah, that one rule that I really didn't like, or that one law that got passed, I really hate that law, and now I'm going to pick up, and everybody's going to go to Colorado, right? Because, grandma and grandpa don't necessarily want to go to Colorado, right? Or, kids, you all don't necessarily want to go to Colorado. And so I think it's a little more complex for certain populations to think about this idea of just kind of, picking up and voting with their feet, because people are encumbered, right? We are a multi-generational family, kind of culture, even though we are not necessarily, the kind of culture that has all of our generations living under one roof. Like some folks do that in the United States, other folks don't, but certainly nobody wants to or intends to live, 3,000 miles away from the people they're responsible for caring for.
Yeah, so like this is how it works, right? The Holocaust happened in Germany, and people didn't leave Germany, right? Like it's not easy to pick up and leave, right? It's not easy to pick up and leave. the people that are the most affected, that are the most vulnerable to government policies, for instance, are also the ones that have the least means, generally speaking, to be able to just kind of pick up and leave. They can't bear the cost of moving, for instance. Moving is expensive for the majority of Americans, right? So that's kind of one point that I wanted to make, right? So the other thing is that we've been kind of bandying around this idea of like laws, right? Like, so the law protects us, the law says this, the law is imperfect. I'm a lawyer. I know the law is imperfect. I'm imperfect, the law is imperfect. And the reason why it's imperfect is because it's created by human beings, right? So the law is this kind of man-made creation that doesn't exist in some kind of crucible of perfection, right? It's applied inconsistently. It depends upon your resources. In other words, how many resources you have determines how favorable the law may be to your situation. What's the attorney you can hire? Can you hire an attorney? Do you have enough sophistication to understand whether you need an attorney, right? Like, do you know if your rights are being violated, right? The law is just a tool, right? And so it's often held up as this kind of panacea, and it's not. Communities that are vulnerable to, let's say, I'm not an expert on voter ID laws, but let's just say something like voter ID, may not even know that this is affecting them in a negative way, may not be able to advocate for their position, may not be able to join other people to advocate for that position, right? So there's a lot of kind of contextual realities on the ground that don't work out in kind of this like ephemeral place where we think the law sits.
Someone else?
Hi, my name's Adam. I'm an econ major here at USC, and I was reading an interesting article by Lucia Graves in The Guardian this morning. She took a less usual, I would say, take on Ivanka Trump's moderating force in the White House. She writes, and I quote, "Crediting Ivanka for nebulous progressive wins, like allegedly stopping homophobic legislation that might have existed, allows Trump to throw red meat to his base while preserving the mythic appeal of Ivanka for the disenchanted. This isn't triangulation, as Trump would have us believe. It isn't even moderation. It's merely obfuscation." What are your takes on the notion that Trump's simply using Ivanka Trump's, I guess you would say, moderating image as a smokescreen to move right on certain issues while also reaching beyond his conservative base?
I can answer that. That reporter's a liar. I know because I was directly involved in that process when Ivanka and Jared weighed in. We went through he's now nominated to be, I think, ambassador to NATO, Rick Grinnell, openly gay Republican, Rick to Ivanka and Jared to get to Trump. It was Ivanka who closed the deal. So I just don't, other than that, I think she is a moderating force. So.
That also speaks to your point about her Trump being a kind of squishy,
I do believe
a squishy
that.
person when it comes to social issues.
He used to be a Democrat, so.
Hi, my name is Maya Harmon. My question is for the entire panel, whoever wants to answer. And so my question is, with this issue of like equal rights for people, and a lot of people are concerned that in this new administration, people's rights are at risk. What do you all think is the best way to ensure that people's rights aren't taken away, considering there's concern taking the legislative process because it's really hard to pass bills and really hard to pass legislation? Is it through legal challenges and through the Supreme Court? Is it through grassroots efforts on the ground, or is it a combination of the three, or something else that I haven't mentioned?
So I can talk just as somebody who used to be an advocate before I joined the government, so I'm not going to tell you exactly how to advocate against this administration. But generally speaking, like advocacy best practices, right, is kind of what you're asking, right? So here's what I found in the last several years working on these issues and seeing how other advocates work, right? There's lots of ways to advocate, but there's three in particular that are very effective, okay? So the first is using the power of the press, right? So when I say the press, I'm not just talking about like newspapers, like the New York Times, traditional press, but also kind of new press, right? Like so writing for Medium or something like that, right? So using the power of the written word to amplify your voice and to target those people that you want to influence. So for instance, I used to work for the Secretary of Homeland Security, right? And it was Janet Napolitano, and then it was Jay Johnson. And both of them would read certain publications, right? So they'd read the Wall Street Journal, read the New York Times, sometimes cover to cover. They definitely read the op-ed section, right? So they'd read editorials and op-eds. So if you want to get straight to the eyeballs of a cabinet level official, that's a great way to go, right? So, writing has still in this country, even though a lot of people don't read anymore, has great power, right? Not you guys, but a lot of other people, right? But so press, right? So writing and sharing your story, right? Reporting and reciting. Another is litigation, right? You kind of brought it up, right? And I'm partial to it because I'm a lawyer, but litigation still in this country, works, right? Like litigation works. Litigation is a check on the power of the government in all branches, right? And done right, and for the right reasons. And it sets precedent, right? So it creates a pattern that kind of comes through the ages, right? So litigation tends to work, right? So if you're a lawyer interested in going to law school, litigation, right? Or even supporting litigation in different ways. You don't have to be a lawyer. And then the last is the electoral process, right? So some of you may be disenchanted with the electoral process right now, or have no interest in the electoral process, or you may think, I live in LA, so I know where the vote's gonna go, so who cares about the electoral process? But there's other things you can do to get involved in the electoral process. And the time, if you feel disenchanted about the electoral process, that's exactly the time to actually get involved, because that means there's a need for people like you to get involved, right? So, and that means fundraising for somebody that you believe in. That means running for office yourself, if that's something that you're interested in. We need young people to run for office, right? Or actually crafting policies for people that are running for office. So litigation, the press, and getting involved in the electoral process. Those are the three things that people in power, the people that work for you, actually resonates with them. They actually listen to and they respond to.
So we're coming to the end of our time. For me, this has been one of the most fascinating of this whole set of panels that we've done so far. I want to thank Ange-Marie. I want to thank Ehsan, who was very enlightening. And John, you're a very good sport because I suspect you're not only in a minority in the state, but you might be in a minority in this room. I want to thank Fabian. I want to thank the audience and remind you that next week we'll do the last of these here, where we'll have students in a millennial perspective on the first 100 days of the 45th President of the United States. And then we'll have our big conference on April 26th. I want to remind you of that too. Thanks a lot. I look forward to these evenings. Thank you for being here.